The square aspect between Saturn and Pluto within a natal chart represents one of the most structurally violent, psychologically grueling, and existential configurations an individual can host in their psychic blueprint. In the archetypal lexicon of astrology, Saturn and Pluto are the ultimate heavyweights, representing two entirely different but equally unyielding expressions of absolute power. Saturn is the principle of the conscious ego structure, the established order, civilization, rigid defense mechanisms, and the safety of the status quo. Pluto, by contrast, is the raw, subterranean volcanic fire of the evolutionary collective, the primeval lord of the underworld representing absolute destruction, inescapable fate, invisible power dynamics, and the necessity of total death and rebirth. When these two cosmic titans lock into a permanent, high-velocity 90°/circ friction gridlock, the individual's psyche becomes an ongoing tectonic fault line. It is the archetype of the cosmic pressure cooker or the unyielding fortress under siege, a lifelong internal reality where the native's conscious need for absolute control is perpetually assaulted by an invisible, subterranean force that threatens to violently dismantle everything they build. To comprehend the torturous internal mechanics of the Saturn-Pluto square is to observe a psychological civil war between the absolute brake pedal and the absolute furnace. For the native, survival is inextricably linked to keeping in tight, iron-fisted control over their environment, their emotions, and their life path. Saturn constructs hyper-vigilant, impenetrable psychological armor designed to keep everything predictable, safe, and regulated. However, because this structure is in a square aspect to Pluto, the internal underworld is constantly generating massive, volcanic currents of unconscious power, primal rage, and evolutionary pressure that seek to tear that armor apart. The native lives with an ambient, bone-deep paranoia, a systemic existential dread that whispers that if they drop their guard for a single second, if they allow themselves to be vulnerable, or if they take their eyes off the horizon, an invisible catastrophe will erupt and violently wipe out their entire existence. They are caught in an exhausting loop. Saturn builds the fortress tighter and higher, while Pluto silently pulls radioactive waste underneath the foundations, ensuring that life is experienced as a perpetual state of high-stakes crisis. This permanent energetic friction manifests in the external world as a series of catastrophic power struggles and sudden, total systemic collapses. The Saturn-Pluto native does not experience normal, gentle transitions. Instead, their lives are marked by distinct, brutal evolutionary checkpoints where the universe acts as an irresistible force meeting their immovable object. They routinely run headfirst into titanic battles with corrupt authority figures, monolithic institutions, or legal and corporate systems that seem maliciously designed to disempower them. Every time the native manages to construct a stable career, a secure home, or a highly controlled lifestyle through sheer, exhausting Saturnian labor, a Plutonian crisis, a sudden economic downturn, a corporate betrayal, an institutional shutdown, or a profound psychological breakdown, erupts to systematically tear it down to the bedrock. The native is forced to watch their hard work turn to ash, triggering an intense, corrosive bitterness and a sense of cosmic victimization before they are forced to pick up the pieces and rebuild from the ground up. The roots of this profound existential trauma are almost invariably traced back to an early childhood environment defined by overwhelming powerlessness, systemic crisis, or an atmospheric terror of total annihilation. The child was typically raised in an environment where the rules were not just strict, but terrifyingly absolute and enforced by a deeply dominant, volatile, or predatory presence. They may have grown up in the shadow of systemic poverty, war, political oppression, or extreme domestic instability where their survival depended entirely on their capacity to read the energetic room, swallow their personal will, and develop an armor-plated psychological defense system before they had an ego to protect. They internalized the lesson that the world is a dangerous, predatory arena where weakness is a death sentence. As adults, they carry a cellular memory of absolute defeat, operating under the subconscious assumption that any relaxed, soft, or undefended posture will immediately invite a lethal counterstrike from the environment. Energetically and physically, hosting this titanic structural friction places an immense, almost unsustainable strain on the individual's physical vehicle. Saturn rules the skeletal structure, the bones, the joints, and the calcification of tissue, while Pluto rules the deep subconscious, the reproductive organs, the eliminative systems, and the cellular mutations within the body. When these two planetary forces collide in a square, the physical body acts as the literal lightning rod for the unexpressed, compressed tension of the psyche. These individuals suffer from an extreme form of somatic armor. They carry their bodies like high-security vaults, keeping their musculature perpetually locked in a state of high-alert defense. This can manifest over time as severe, chronic spinal compression, premature joint degradation, and structural alignment crises. Furthermore, because Pluto rules toxic accumulation and Saturn rules blockage, this aspect is a notorious signature for severe eliminative blockages, tumors, cysts, and deep systemic toxicities, as the physical tissue accurately materializes the rigid, unyielding refusal of the mind to let go of control. Yet, the ultimate evolutionary architecture of the Saturn-Pluto square is not designed to permanently break or victimize the native, but to forge an completely invincible, diamond-hard column of authentic spiritual and worldly authority. This aspect does not permit a casual, superficial, or fragile existence. It is an elite warrior's training ground. The universe subjects them to endless structural bottlenecks, power struggles, and devastating purges not to punish them, but to burn away every single drop of their egoic attachment to superficial safety, manipulative control, and false security. They are being systematically re-engineered to discover that true power is not the capacity to prevent a crisis, but the absolute, unshakable capacity to stand entirely unfazed in the absolute center of the wreckage. The supreme liberation for this placement requires a radical, terrifying psychological death. The native must willingly surrender their illusion of conscious control. The agonizing, repeating cycle of build and destroy only ceases when the individual undergoes a profound shift in perspective, realizing that the terrifying, destructive force they have been fighting so viciously in the outside world is actually the hand of their own higher soul, attempting to liberate them from the prison of their own rigid defenses. They must learn to tolerate the immense vulnerability of collapse, to let the old structures fall without fighting, and to trust the primordial, Plutonian current of regeneration to carry them forward. When a Saturn-Pluto square native finally alchemizes this aspect, shifting from a paralyzed, paranoid captive of their own fortress into a sovereign master of concentrated evolutionary force, a magnificent transfiguration occurs. The heavy, defensive armor dissolves, leaving behind an unbreakable, magnetic monument of pure, unshakable authority. They emerge into the second half of life as the ultimate crisis anchors and architects of deep systemic transformation. Because they have sat in the absolute hottest furnaces of internal frustration, looked directly into the absolute jaws of psychological death, and survived the total annihilation of their ego attachments, they possess an unmatched, terrifying stamina. They become the individuals who can walk completely unafraid into the most chaotic, collapsing, and high-pressure environments on Earth, take the entire weight of a crisis onto their shoulders with an unblinking composure, and rebuild a collapsing civilization from the ashes because their power was forged in the absolute zero of self-mastery. To dismantle the outermost armored defenses of the Saturn-Pluto square is to uncover a psychological landscape that has been explicitly engineered to function as a bunker for existential warfare. While the visible manifestation of this aspect often presents as a chillingly resilient capability to handle catastrophic situations, an ironclad self-reliance, and an almost hypnotic authority under pressure, a clinical descent into its core reveals a darker reality. The native operates under a permanent subconscious mandate that dictates survival is only possible if they remain more dangerous, more calculated, and more hyper-vigilant than the predatory environment around them. Saturn is the conscious ego trying to preserve its identity through rigid boundaries. Pluto is the primordial death drive of evolutionary necessity. The square places these two in a vice grip of perpetual trauma looping, where the individual spends decades weaponizing their own defense structures, fully convinced that to relax their control for a single second is to invite immediate, total annihilation. The most profound, insidious pathology of this configuration is a phenomenon that can be defined as the obsession with systemic fortification. Because the native's nervous system was calibrated by early environments where sudden, violent shifts or absolute disempowerment occurred without warning, they develop an addiction to absolute self-sufficiency. A Saturn-Pluto square individual cannot tolerate relying on anyone or anything outside of their direct sphere of control. In their professional and personal lives, they systematically eliminate all variables of dependency. They must own the land, control the finances, dictate the logistics, and possess a total, psychic awareness of every vulnerability in their perimeter. The tragedy of this hyper-vigilance is that it transforms their entire life into a grim, exhausting military campaign. They cannot enjoy the wealth, the status, or the stable relationships they build because they are too busy auditing them for structural flaws, treating every partner, colleague, or external circumstance as a potential sleeper agent of a looming Plutonian betrayal. This permanent internal mobilization breeds a dangerous behavioral mechanism known as the preemptive counterstrike. Because these individuals carry a subterranean ocean of repressed, generational rage and a profound terror of being dominated, they routinely misinterpret normal life friction as existential warfare. If an institution imposes a minor bureaucratic regulation, or if a partner attempts to assert an independent boundary, the Saturn-Pluto square native decodes it as a calculated conspiracy to castrate their personal sovereignty. Instead of negotiating, their internal system immediately shifts to a wartime footing. They launch devastatingly cold, calculated, and completely disproportionate counter-assaults designed to utterly neutralize the perceived threat before it can manifest. This tactical ruthlessness often creates the exact reality they dread. They inadvertently alienate their allies, provoke the wrath of powerful institutions, and invite the massive, crushing retaliations that force their lives into a cycle of catastrophic collapse. Furthermore, this aspect creates a highly problematic, almost masochistic relationship with the process of psychological and physical flagellation. The Saturn-Pluto native possesses a deep-seated contempt for anything that feels soft, comfortable, or inherently easy. They suffer from an ambient guilt whenever life is fluid, viewing peace as a dangerous anesthesia that leaves them vulnerable to ambush. To cure the anxiety of a calm horizon, they will unconsciously engineer their own crises. They are drawn to dying corporations, highly toxic and volatile power structures, and intense, psychologically cannibalistic relationships where they must constantly fight for survival. They are addicted to the sheer gravity of the bottom of the wheel. To the twisted, survivalist calculus of this square, feeling the absolute weight of suffering and enduring a brutal, soul-crushing grind with unyielding, tight-lipped silence is the only authentic state of being, leading them to view exhaustion not as a warning sign, but as proof of their invincibility. On a genetic and karmic level, this square indicates that the individual has been appointed as the absolute executioner of a bloodline's unvetted shadows and systemic corruption. They inherit a cellular matrix choked by generations of ancestors who survived through the cold accumulation of power at the expense of their humanity, or who were utterly crushed under the boot of totalitarian regimes, historical upheavals, or profound societal abuses. The native does not just carry personal stress, they carry the compacted, radioactive trauma weight of 100 dead patriarchs and matriarchs. Their psychic atmosphere feels heavy because they are the designated circuit breaker who must choose either to consciously face, dismantle, and alchemize this volatile ancestral inheritance, or let it repeat its destructive cycle by physically and psychologically fracturing their own life structures. The ultimate evolutionary liberation for the Saturn-Pluto native requires a radical, terrifying act of existential capitulation. They must learn the supreme courage of allowing their fortress to fall. The agonizing, repeating cycle of building structures only to have them violently purged by fate will never cease until the native realizes that the tyrannical, destructive monster they are fighting in the external world is actually the hand of their own higher evolution, trying to break them out of the suffocating tomb of their own rigid defenses. They must undergo a total psychological death, willingly dropping their heavy, manipulative control mechanisms, sitting exposed in the wreckage of their plans, and discovering that when everything they thought kept them safe is stripped away, their core essence remains completely untouchable. When a Saturn-Pluto square native finally alchemizes this aspect, shifting from a paranoid, self-sabotaging survivalist into a sovereign master of concentrated evolutionary force, a magnificent transfiguration occurs. The heavy, armor-plated ego shell dissolves, leaving behind an unbreakable, magnetic pillar of pure worldly and spiritual power. They emerge into the second half of life completely immune to the intimidations, manipulations, and crises of the collective. Having sat in the absolute hottest furnaces of internal frustration, stared directly into the abyss of their own monstrous shadows, and survived the total annihilation of their superficial attachments, they possess an unmatched, terrifying stamina. They become the ultimate crisis anchors, master strategists, and architects of deep, enduring systemic transformations, individuals who can walk completely unafraid into the most chaotic, collapsing environments on Earth, hold the entire weight of a civilization on their shoulders with an unblinking composure, and manifest monumental realities because their willpower was forged in the absolute zero of self-mastery. To penetrate the absolute lowest, atomic bedrock of the Saturn-Pluto square is to expose a psychic apparatus that has entirely replaced the natural self-preservation of the human ego with the cold, unyielding architecture of a nuclear fallout bunker. While the higher layers of this configuration present as a terrifyingly resilient strategic mind, an unshakable stoicism, and a legendary capacity to anchor massive organizations during times of collapse, the ultimate diagnostic core reveals an internal landscape running on an absolute zero of existential despair. The native operates under a profound, unshakable subconscious conviction that reality is a predatory slaughterhouse where any open display of vulnerability, softening, or undefended peace will immediately invite an inescapable, lethal counterstrike from the environment. Saturn is the conscious mind trying to build order and predictable boundaries. Pluto is the absolute, primordial volcanic fire of evolutionary necessity looking to melt all form back into the collective soup. This creates a state of permanent somatic and psychological gridlock where the individual spends their entire life running an immense current of raw, subterranean survival force through an ego circuit that has been intentionally, systematically welded shut out of pure, unadulterated terror. The most insidious, unexamined pathology of this placement is a phenomenon that can be defined as the eroticization of the cataclysm. Because the native's nervous system is completely unaccustomed to smooth, effortless forward momentum or uncomplicated safety, their entire psychological reward system becomes inextricably hardwired to the experience of extreme resistance. When they encounter a life path that is peaceful, a professional environment that is collaborative and supportive, or a romantic partnership that offers immediate, uncomplicated, and warm emotional availability, the Saturn-Pluto native experiences an acute, terrifying disorientation. The lack of structural friction and looming danger feels to them like an existential vacuum chamber, triggering a profound sense of unreality and worthlessness. To cure this ambient anxiety, they will instinctively turn away from ease and throw themselves into situations defined by systematic hostility. They become psychically dependent on the crisis. They only know who they are when they are standing on a crumbling cliffside fighting an impossible, monolithic adversary, confusing the exhausting ache of emotional and physical self-flagellation with the authentic ecstasy of being alive. This permanent internal mobilization breeds a dangerous psychological mutation known as the clinical freeze-rage loop. Because the direct expression of personal will, primal anger, and defensive boundaries is strictly forbidden by the internal Saturnian warden out of fear of provocative retaliation, the native does not experience anger as a clean, passing emotional storm. Instead, when they are violated, exploited, or threatened, the Saturn-Pluto current instantly drops their nervous system into a state of deep dorsal vagal shutdown, a literal psychological and physical freeze. They stiffen, their throat constricts, their face goes blank, and they adopt an aura of chilling, aristocratic indifference or quiet submission. However, the rage does not vanish, it is compressed into a highly volatile, toxic state of psychic plutonium. For months or even decades, this repressed, subterranean fury eats away at the tissues of their body and mind, manifesting as a bitter, calculated cynicism, a weaponized coldness, or a profound, clinical depression. And when a minor, inconsequential trigger finally breaches the dam, the explosion is never proportional to the immediate event. It is a terrifying, apocalyptic discharge of the accumulated, compressed fury of a lifetime, leaving everyone around them permanently traumatized by the sudden glimpse of the underworld monster lurking beneath the stoic saint. Furthermore, this square enforces a brutal, ongoing audit of the physical body, treating the flesh not as a vehicle for sensory pleasure or vital expression, but as an unruly, deeply flawed beast of burden that must be broken to ensure survival. Saturn-Pluto individuals possess an absolute, deep-seated contempt for their own physical vulnerabilities and natural limitations. They treat illness, fatigue, and pain not as normal biological signals to rest, but as personal humiliations, signs of moral failure, and dangerous cracks in their armor. They are intensely prone to somatic calcification, their bodies literally turning to stone to match the rigid, defensive rules of their minds. This manifests as the premature degradation of the deep bone matrix, severe spinal compression, arthritis, chronic reproductive and eliminative system shutdowns, and the systemic hardening of the arteries, as the body accurately materializes the rigid, unyielding, and self-punishing survival parameters of the mind's internal warden. On an evolutionary and cosmic level, this square represents the absolute apex of the warrior's training. The Saturn-Pluto native is a highly advanced soul that has deliberately chosen to undergo an energetic sterilization process so that it can discover the ultimate occult secret of power, that true force is not born from the loud, chaotic, and sloppy explosions of the ego, nor from the control of external variables, but from the absolute containment, concentration, and crystallization of intent. The universe subjects them to endless delays, structural bottlenecks, and humiliating defeats not to destroy them, but to burn away every single drop of their impatience, entitlement, and superficial vanity. They are being systematically re-engineered into the ultimate instruments of destiny. The ultimate liberation for this placement occurs when the native ceases to view the internal Saturnian brake pedal as an external executioner trying to kill them, and instead begins to consciously wield it as the flawlessly calibrated steering mechanism of a high-performance machine. This requires them to undergo a terrifying psychological surrender. They must stop trying to force open doors that the universe has locked, drop their heavy, combative armor, and learn to sit completely still in the dark without feeling that their stillness is a form of death. When a Saturn-Pluto native finally alchemizes this aspect, shifting from a paralyzed, self-sabotaging captive into a supreme master of concentrated force, they undergo a magnificent, unparalleled transfiguration. The heavy iron cage dissolves, leaving behind an invincible, diamond-hard column of pure worldly authority. They emerge into the world entirely immune to the provocations, intimidations, and threats of lesser wills. Because they have sat in the absolute hottest furnaces of internal frustration and mastered the terrifying architecture of their own shadow, they possess an unmatched, terrifying stamina. They become the ultimate structural executioners, legendary crisis anchors, and architects of enduring empires, individuals who can step into the absolute center of a chaotic, collapsing world, hold the entire weight of a civilization on their shoulders with an unblinking, majestic composure, and manifest monumental realities through the sheer, unstoppable gravity of their silent, disciplined willpower. Subscribe, like, and share.